The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's webinar entitled Call Authentication for Non-IP Networks, TRACED Act Compliance. I am Steve Barclay, Senior Director of Global Standards Development with ATIS, and I am today's moderator. Before we begin, let me remind you that this webinar is being recorded for future playback. All participants are muted by default and placed in listen-only mode. Should you have any questions, please submit those via the Questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We will queue the questions as they arrive, and we'll address questions once all presentations are complete, and we will try to address as many of your questions as possible. In addition, the slides will be distributed shortly after the completion of the webinar to all registered participants, and a recording of the webinar will be made available online. Before we begin, I would like to introduce today's panelists that are Tom Good, ATIS General Counsel, Phil Lindsey, Director of Public Policy at CenturyLink, as well as the Chair of the ATIS PTSC Non-IP Call Authentication Task Force, and Jim McEachern, ATIS Principal Technologist. Tom, Phil, and Jim, thank you for joining us today. Next slide, please. So on slide 2 is just a brief agenda for today's webinar, which is being displayed. We'll provide a brief overview of ATIS for those who may be unfamiliar, overview the regulatory landscape specifically targeting at the TRACED Act, which preceded the creation of the ATIS Task Force, outline the details of the task force, and examine its current work program. In closing, we should have time for a few questions and answers. Next slide, please. So on slide 3, just a brief word about ATIS. We are a technology and solutions development organization with nearly 200 companies actively participating in our industry forums. ATIS brings together the top global ICT companies to advance the industry's most pressing business priorities. In addition, membership in ATIS is open to the various ICT stakeholders. I will note the ATIS membership is not a prerequisite for participation in ATIS's new task force that is under discussion today, and additional information is available in Phil's presentation. ATIS is accredited by the American National Standards Institute and is the North American partner in 3GPP. ATIS's partnership in 3GPP allows for coordination among ATIS members to represent not only its business needs, but also requirements for the North American region. Slide 4. The next slide provides a high-level overview of the various activities sponsored by ATIS, and I won't go into detail about all these activities, but I did want to point out that the Packet Technologies and Systems Committee, which is PTSC, which is circled on the screen, is where the new non-IP Call Authentication Task Force, also referred to as NIPCA, resides. And throughout today's presentations, you may hear references to PTSC and NIPCA. So those are the acronyms for our activities. On the next slide, what I'd like to do is turn the presentation over to Tom Good of ATIS, who will dive into some of the regulatory aspects related to the task force. Tom, take it away.
Terrific. Thank you, Steve. So we can go to the next slide. As Steve mentioned, I'm Tom Good. I'm General Counsel with ATIS. And I'll provide a brief overview of our high-level overview of the Telephone Robocall Abuse Criminal Enforcement and Deterrence Act, thankfully distilled down to the TRACED Act, which was enacted at the end of last year to deter unlawful robocalls and enhance the government's enforcement capabilities. There was a fairly extensive act addressing a number of issues. I'll highlight some of the most pertinent issues, most relevant, including the timelines established for the implementation of the call authentication frameworks in IP and non-IP networks. So we can go to slide 7. So the TRACED Act, at a broadest level, requires the FCC to require providers of voice services to, within 18 months, implement Shaken within the IP portions of their networks, and also to take reasonable measures to implement an effective call authentication framework in the provider's non-IP networks. We go to the next slide. There is a little bit of a strange way the FCC, the act is worded, because there's also provisions related to that specifying the mandate would not be implemented if the FCC finds that there's voluntary action. And for IP networks, this would mean that the voice service provider has adopted the Shaken framework for calls on its IP network, has agreed to voluntarily participate with other providers of voice service in the authentication framework, has begun to implement Shaken, and will be fully capable of implementing Shaken within 18 months. And more relevant for this group is the provision that says that for non-IP networks, This voluntary action that would foreclose or delay mandate would mean that a voice service provider has taken reasonable measures to implement an effective call authentication framework and will be capable of fully implementing this framework within 18 months. We go to the next slide. So these are the main timeline-related issues. There are also other relevant provisions. Specifically, the FCC must assess burdens and barriers to call authentication, including the extent to which a voice service network uses time division multiplexing, impacts on small providers and those in rural areas, and then also any issues related to the unavailability of or carriers' inability to purchase or upgrade equipment to support call authentication frameworks. The extension of the 18-month implementation deadline is available for undue hardship for a provider or class of providers or type of calls as necessary. And so the FCC will look at providing potentially extensions for any of those. But even if an extension of the deadline is granted, the FCC is required to require carriers to take reasonable steps to prevent illegal calls from originating on their networks. We go to the next slide. Other relevant provisions, the FCC is required to submit a report to Congress within 12 months to analyze the extent to which providers of voice service have implemented the call authentication frameworks, including whether the availability of necessary equipment and equipment upgrades has impacted such implementation. And the FCC is also required to assess the efficacy of the call authentication frameworks in addressing all aspects of call authentication. There's also provision under the TRACE Act, which requires the FCC to issue best practices that providers may use as part of the implementation of effective call authentication frameworks, and to take steps to ensure that the calling party is accurately identified. We go to the next slide, slide 11. So those are the big issues that I thought were most relevant under the TRACE Act. There are other issues that are also very important. There's a safe harbor proposal related to the FCC issuing rules within 1 year that would block a liability for a caller or for a service provider that blocks calls based on information provided by call authentication networks. TraceBack, which is very complementary to the efforts of a call authentication framework like Shaken. The FCC is required to establish a process for the registration of a TraceBack consortium and to solicit potential candidates, and actually that is in the process. Enforcement, the TRACE Act also includes a number of provisions aimed at enforcing enhancing enforcement, which includes extending some of the TCPA statute of limitations, creating an interagency task force, and also streamlining the voluntary reporting of violations by private parties. And then another key component of the TRACE Act is the access and use of telephone numbers. So the FCC is examining its policies related to numbering resources, including toll-free numbers, and how they can be modified to reduce access to numbers by potential perpetrators of violations. So we go to the next slide, and last slide, slide 12. So that's a high-level view of some of the more relevant provisions of the TRACE Act. I think obviously this informed our decision to launch this new task force. I think there is a need to consider non-IP call authentication issues. And we have been in contact with the FCC, and they're aware of the formation of the task force. And informally, they've expressed support for this, the new activity. So we're obviously going to be updating the FCC on this. I think it's obviously related to the industry's requirements of the TRACE Act. And so we will plan on keeping a close relationship with the FCC and keeping them updated. So with that, I think I will turn this over to Phil Lindsey for the next part of this.
Thank you, Tom. My name is Phil Lindsey with CenturyLink, and I've been asked to be the chair for the PTSC's non-IP call authentication task force. And so if we start out with slide 14. So ATIS has been at the forefront of call authentication initiatives through the ATIS and SIPFORM partnership through the IP&I task force. This was established back, or at least the call authentication proposal was initiated in the summer of 2015. And since then, ATIS has proven its expertise in understanding the emerging technologies and applying those technologies to the real world challenges like we've got in front of us today as an industry with the illegal robocallings and illegal spoofing, those kinds of things. ATIS PTSC brings a critical expertise in this in two ways. Their current focus through the IP&I task force and IP networks and the standards around call authentication, i.e. the Shaken standard, and then the deep understanding of the TDM network standards. That extends back to I think Committee T1 and the development of SS7 standards. And then this provides the ability in the challenge to apply this call authentication to the non-IP TDM networks, which is kind of the reason, one of the reasons for this new task force. We can move to slide 15. So we had our inaugural meeting on June 1st, 2020. Our next meeting is actually coming up in the next couple of days, and on Friday. The significance here, I think, if you think about it from the perspective of how this originally developed in the summer of 2015, I think there was probably about 15, and at most there was 20 people in the room when the Shaken concept was brought into the IP&I meeting here in Denver. On June 1st, on our kickoff meeting for a non-IP call authentication task force, we had over 80 folks on the call. And then from an IP&I perspective, and then their meetings have grown to, at least 60 people, 50 to 60 people are pretty typical. So this has been a very visible and important as people have recognized across the industry. So we've got a strong technical program with contributions already made, and Jim will review a lot of that in his presentation. It overviews it's an overview of the problem, and then we've already received contributions for 4 call authentication mechanisms. And then as far as being able to register for this group, got a link here that would provide you with access to that registration process. So, we can move to slide 16, I think. So the charter of the NIPCA task force is focused on call authentication for TDM-based service providers, and that includes originating service providers, transiting service providers, and terminating service providers, all in TDM. The task force will complement the work already being done at the IP&I. This doesn't replace anything that the IP&I task force is working on. It's really to help relieve the volume of work that's currently going on. The IP&I task force is currently working on existing challenges associated with the current Shaken standard. The task force will identify and document the call authentication challenges facing TDM networks. First and foremost is just that, Shaken is based on an IP network concept, and so that's the most significant challenge. But the group is to look at the multiple challenges that are associated with that. That's the study of all the TDM challenges there. The first step is really to understand the problem, which I think we've got a pretty good start on that. But if we move into slide 17, we can get into the second step, which is the education portion of this. PTSC is known for having the expertise in as far as TDM experts, and many of the IP&I members are also PTSC members. So we're drawing on much of that, and there's, I think, a lot of dual participation, I think, between the two groups, which will also assist in making sure that we do this efficiently and that we don't that we collaborate well with IP&NI. This leverages the ATIS expertise to ensure the entire group understands the IP nature of Shaken, architecture, and the governance model. What's depicted on this slide on the bottom left is the architecture, and on the bottom right is the governance structure. We want to move on to slide 18. So the third step is the analysis, is to investigate the feasibility of TDM call authentication frameworks, including how these interwork with Shaken. Although there's been some publicity around potential TDM mechanisms, there appears to be little awareness and really no documentation on the potential alternatives. So that's one of the benefits of this group, will be to take a broader look at what capabilities, what functionalities exist out there that could help allow for interworking of call authentication between TDM networks and IP networks. And then this group will then further advance those call authentication issues for TDM networks, and that's all developed on a consensus-based position that is consistent with the operations of ATIS. So we can probably move to the next slide, slide 19. So the fourth step is feasibility. So we need to evaluate the viability of implementation of the proposed call authentication mechanisms for TDM. The analysis is intended to understand the network implications of deployment. Some mechanisms may require more functionality and associated costs than others. These mechanisms will need to be evaluated against current standards to avoid adverse outcomes. One of the main principles of this type of work is to make sure that we don't break anything that we need to keep operating going forward. And so this will be an important aspect of this evaluation as well. And then from the future work, based on kind of the results of the work to this point, then we'll evaluate the need to develop best practices for call authentication in the TDM networks. So if we move to the next slide, slide 20. So the non-IP call authentication task force and the IP&NI task force are complementary. They're designed to be complementary. One of the efforts that the IP&NI is undertaking, which is to address specifically those challenges of the IP&NI or the IP network. This allows for that work to continue and allows for the TDM specific stuff, which is actually at more of a nascent stage than the Shaken technology. Thus, it keeps that IP&NI effort to keep moving forward without having to slow down and work on potentially even parallel type efforts on the TDM network. The non-IP call authentication task force, is identifying those alternatives, evaluating and the deployment of the viability, and then potentially developing those standards and best practices. I think with that, we can move to slide 21. Slide 21 is basically the timeline, and Tom had indicated in his portion of the webinar that the SEC or the Congress enacted the TRACED Act in December. We received an order from the SEC in March, and then of course on June 1st we had our inaugural meeting for the non-IP call authentication task force. So basically we've got the subsequent work that's beginning essentially on Friday. we've got the framework for the technical requirements, and then the investigation of those TDM authentication mechanisms, and then the evaluation of the implementation viability, and then ultimately providing a readout on the work that we accomplished. And that's, you know, due in second quarter 2021. And if most folks probably recognize that June 30th of 2021 is essentially the date that has been provided for implementation by providers. So we try to get this aligned with that schedule so that you know, the industry can essentially align with the compliance aspect of the Act. So, with that, I can hand this over to Jim. He's going to go through kind of the details of the program, and so take it away, Jim. Thanks.
Thanks, all. So if you go to the next slide. So Phil was talking about, just to set some context about the technical program here. I'll go into a little bit of details on the work we have underway and where that might go forward. But I just want to step back a bit. Phil mentioned that when the IP&I task force started working on Shaken, if we got more than 20 people into a room, it was a sellout crowd, and we were struggling for seats. Today, 50 to 60 is pretty common. And for the first call for this working group, for this task force, we had north of 80 people in the room for the program. So this is generating a lot of interest in the industry. And the technical program we have underway reflects that. Again, we've had one short meeting just getting started, and we already at this point have 5 distinct activities that are underway, and in many cases have baseline documents available for them. So I'll go into a bit more detail. The first area is basically creating a landscape, a technical report that looks at the alternatives for call authentication for non-IP traffic. Again, each of these I'll go into more detail, but we also then have a number of specific proposals from people for solutions, for frameworks that could be useful in TDM networks for call authentication. So I'll provide a little bit more detail on each of these. If you go to the next slide. So the first thing is the landscape report. The idea here is that there are, I mean, it's one thing to say TDM networks, but of course there are a lot of variations of TDM networks and mixed networks where part of it's TDM and part of it's SIP. And so understanding what all those scenarios are is important to ensuring that we can effectively address them and consider them as we go forward. So this and the diagram you see here is one particular scenario taken from the document. In this case, you have a SIP network that has SIP signaling, but at the terminating end, it's actually a TDM network where you need to terminate the traffic, and so you identify how you would deal with that. So this is one scenario. This document goes through all the other scenarios where you have TDM as part of the network. Really wants to understand at an architectural level what that means, and therefore what you might have to do to provide call authentication for that. It identifies potential frameworks to deal with this. Now that's already well underway, as you saw from the work program. But one of the more interesting objectives of this work is to propose the relevant factors that should be considered when you start evaluating these frameworks. You know, what are the important factors in assessing a potential framework for non-IP call authentication? So I'll give you a kind of an example of the kind of things that is included in there. Is really this should be a solution that interworks in some way with Shaken. You don't want to have something that's a completely different solution that only applies to TDM networks and can't interwork at some level with Shaken. It's going to be far less useful if you can't do that. So that's an example of the kind of thing that that would be included in these list of relevant factors. So next slide. So now I'm going to go into and give you just a bit of a flavor of each of the proposals that are currently on the table. I don't know of any other ones that might come, but who knows, there might even be additional ones, but we already have 4, as I mentioned earlier. So the first one is basically we're calling it TDM Shaken. This is a flavor of the Autobahn Shaken work that's being proposed in the IPNI task force and progressed. But it's really taken that Autobahn, the Shaken ecosystem, and in particular using the Autobahn aspects, and extending it to TDM networks. The key thing here in this proposal, if you want to get up to the essence of it, is it has TDM providers that basically agree among themselves in a community to work together, and essentially creates a TDM island, is the way I like to think of it. And within that TDM island, you can use Autobahn Shaken to basically communicate the Shaken passports. And at the edge of that island, you convert to pure SIP signaling, and that Autobahn Shaken passport can now go in band in the SIP signaling, and in that way it interworks seamlessly with Shaken. In fact, if you get to the other end, the terminating service provider won't even know that it started in TDM, because the passports are completely compatible and interchangeable, interworkable. One of the other, and by the way, that TDM community also needs to include the transit providers in this case, but again, that's one of the implications of this. And as I alluded to before, one interesting thing about it is it doesn't place any new requirements on the VoIP service providers, and in fact, they might not even be aware that it started in TDM networks, which is worth noting. Next slide. And while we're getting there, that proposal I just went through, that's been put on the table. Obviously, this working group will be continuing to progress that, flesh it out, understand the implications, and put it into a fully baked framework. Next one is initial call validation mechanism. This again looks at a number of scenarios and in ways in which this can complement some of the other authentication mechanisms. And what I'm showing here is just one example diagram from this proposal. In this case, you on the left have a TDM network that is using SIP signaling to communicate to SIP networks, and that the components circled in red basically are using existing legacy TDM interfaces to gather information from the TDM network and use that information to determine what level of attestation the service provider can provide for that call. You know, do you know it came from an existing number, or do you not know if it came from an existing number? Because, for example, it might be from a PBX. And based on that information, it then uses an STI authentication service function to generate a proper passport, Shaken passport, and include it in the SIP signaling at the edge of the network. So this can be very handy if you have a number of switches within the network, and so you can't be generating the passports at each individual switch, but you can use this to generate it at the edge of the network and have the same accuracy and reliability of information. This is one diagram. The proposal identifies a number of other scenarios where that level of functionality and information can fit into the overall architecture. And in that sense, they say it looks like it could complement other mechanisms, and so might prove to be very interesting. Next slide. The next proposal is out-of-band, called out-of-band token transmission for TDM. Basically, this again complements the work, out-of-band Shaken work that's being progressed in the IPNI task force today. And what it does is it focuses on the TDM service providers. So if you look at the diagram on the left, you'll notice the top two boxes, the STI-AS and the SKS, those functions are unique to Shaken, whereas everything else in that diagram is unique to existing, or is seen in existing TDM networks. So this shows exactly how you could put in a function into an existing TDM network that would have the information necessary to generate a shaken passport. Again, in this case, it appears associated with each individual TDM switch, so the information is right there. And the diagram on the right shows the additional functions you need to add at the terminating end to, again, terminate the shaken passports. So, and in between, it implicitly uses out-of-band shaken to transmit the information. So again, that's a proposal that adds more detail and richness to the framework of ways we might deal with TDM networks and provide call authentication for that, and fit into the broader shaken architecture and ecosystem. Next slide. The final proposal we have is one that really is trying to extend the information that is available in Stir and Shaken to do with what you know about the caller and whether or not you can attest to that, and allow that to be transferred over TDM networks. So in this case, what you have is on the left, an invite, a SIP invite is coming in, but the rest of it is using TDM interconnect. And so is there some way to map that shaken information onto the TDM signaling so that you cannot lose the information that you had in the SIP network? And it's worth pointing out here that a number of years ago, PTSC did an analysis of basically looking at, can you take all the information that's included in SIP, in Shaken, sorry, and can you map that into TDM and preferably map it back at the other end so that you can in fact take all the rich information in Shaken and just interwork it with TDM? And the answer in that case was that in general, you can't count on that always working. It might work in some cases, but you can't count on it, and therefore it's not a reliable mechanism. The difference here is that they took that you can't do that in all cases, and they said, well, let's look at the cases where you can do it. And if we start making some assumptions, and if service providers agree to work together in a consistent way, then can you get something useful? And it might not be 100% of what you had, but it might be a lot better than nothing. And so instead of a general problem, it's asking a very specific problem so that we can, again, expand the coverage. And once you do that, the answer might be quite different than it is in the general case where you're trying to solve it for every possible scenario. So that's going to be a very interesting activity that's really quite mature and will be pressed forward. Next slide. So those are the activities, and now I want to look at kind of the future work that we have queued up. The first two bullets here are the ones that I've been talking about so far. And again, those are already underway. In most cases, they have documents available with baseline text that's being progressed. And our immediate focus is going to be on pushing those forward and progressing them as quickly as possible. Once that gets reasonably mature, then we get into the third and fourth items of investigating the feasibility and looking at the viability of implementing them in actual real networks. And in that case, we're going to use the scenarios and the criteria identified in the first activity, the first bullet, and apply that to the specific framework proposals identified in the second bullet, second work item, to conduct that investigation and really, again, not pick a winner, as it were, but really understand what it means. If you take this approach, what will that mean in terms of what service providers need to deploy functionality, where would that function have to be deployed, how effective would it be at interworking, the kinds of things that give you a sense of the viability of this and the implications of deploying it. And then, of course, we will document the results of that assessment and as mentioned in previous presentations, also continue to keep the FCC and the industry informed of that and do various readouts. And again, through all this, the goal is to really fully understand what it is possible, what it is practical to do in terms of call authentication for non-IP networks, for TDM networks, and create the information, the basis for informed decisions moving forward. And that actually, I think if we go to the next one, takes me to the end of my section, and I'll hand it back to Steve for Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Tom and Phil as well. So just before we move into the Q&A session, I did want to inform attendees that information about the task force is available via our website, which is atis.org, atis.org, and by clicking on the Strategic Initiatives menu option and then navigating to the non-IP call authentication task force. You can also use the link that was in Phil's presentation, and again, we'll be sharing these slides after the meeting. So at this time, we'll begin the Q&A portion of the webinar. As you may have already seen, there is a questions tab in the control panel, and that is where you should provide all of your questions. To those of you that did submit questions online, thank you. And so we will begin with, why isn't this work being done in the ATIS Forum IP&I task force? And Jim, I think that might be a good one for you.
Yeah, happy to answer that. So the real reason is, sorry, there's a couple of reasons. One key one is that the IP&I task force is very busy, has a really robust technical program. It's working on things like delegate certificates that will allow enterprises that have complex calling scenarios like call centers that they use and numbers that they get from multiple service providers. It will allow them to get full attestation for their calls. And so there's a lot of interest in that. It's also work on rich call data, RCD, that will support calling name authentication within networks, and various ones for emergency services. And given this robust program, adding in TDM authentication, call authentication, is risks overloading the group, and to some extent defocusing it. In addition, while IP&I Task Force has clearly the expertise on call authentication, it doesn't have as much expertise on TDM networks and on the protocols behind that, which of course PTSC does. And because PTSC and ATIS has that expertise combined with the tight linkages to the IP&I Task Force, it was a natural way to proceed. And we will continue to work very closely to make sure that we aren't at cross purposes. Back to you, Steve.
Okay, thank you, Jim. We do have a handful of questions coming in. The next question is, some believe that the nation's migration to an all IP is imminent and that this TDM effort is therefore futile. What is your reaction to that belief? Phil, is that one you'd be willing to take?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, the Shaken standard does not necessarily restrict, you know, the implementation of something on a TDM network and interoperability with it. And I think that the challenge is, and in part of the viability aspect of, I think the group's work will need to look at, you know, what is the prospect for potentially further ingraining a legacy network like TDM network into and propagate it going forward versus the flexibility to basically or even encourage the transition to IP and the technology transition. So I don't think it's futile. I just think it's one of those things that's going to need to be considered as we evaluate the different alternatives.
Okay. Thank you, Phil. One other question is, will one solution be chosen for the industry? And actually, I'm going to merge two together. Will one solution be chosen for the industry, and where can alternate approaches be submitted? And Phil, would you be willing to take that one as well?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the objective isn't necessarily to pick one. We're not directed necessarily to pick a winner or loser. It's really identifying the different alternatives and the viability of each of those alternatives, and then let the market determine kind of the direction on that. And then as far as submitting alternatives, of course, anybody that is a member of the group has the ability to submit contributions into the group as an alternative.
Okay, thank you. I think the next one might be for Jim, who is our north of the border representative. How does the work of ATIS non-IP call authentication task force interact with Canada and other more international standards bodies?
A couple, I guess there's two questions in there. So the ATIS through the IP&I task force has developed a specification for cross-border shaken, and that lays out exactly how you would basically federate two countries so that calls authenticated in one country could be verified in the second country, and that standard exists. In addition, we're working with the Canadian Governance Authority to ensure that we stay aligned, and certainly Canada is looking to use the specifications in the coming from the IP&I task force, and a number of Canadian carriers are in fact active in this task force. So the linkages are there. The broader, if you get the question of more international standards bodies, I mean, at this point, the reality is that the IP&I task force and this task force, the non-IP called authentication task force, are essentially leading in terms of developing the relevant standards. The one caveat I'll put in there is obviously our standards are based on and working closely with the IETF to make sure that we align there. But basically IP&I and the IETF are leading the industry in terms of call authentication as far as I'm concerned.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim. We have a few more questions that came in. One question is, how often does the task force plan to meet? Phil, I know that's a pretty straightforward question. You want to grab that one?
Yeah, I think we're looking at like a couple times a month, I think is kind of what we're shooting for. You know, unless there's a different demand, and it might be dependent on the contributions and the amount and the volume of work that we get confronted with. So it'll be a kind of a flexible thing there too. So
yeah, and this is Steve, and I can agree, and as needed, I think is also appropriate in case we need to spin up more meetings versus less.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see, there are a couple questions here. It says, when referring to TDM networks, it assumes CCS7 capable end offices. Is this program also looking at non-CCS7 capable end office, or is CCS7 a basic prerequisite?
I'm
Jim
happy
or
to take that,
Phil? Okay, Jim, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So the current activities we have assume it's SS7 signaling end offices, but like most ATIS groups, we're contribution driven. So if someone has a proposal and or the interest and comes in with a proposal for other end offices, there's no reason why we wouldn't consider it. But so far, we haven't seen any indications that that's likely. I don't know if you want to add anything, Phil?
no, that's exactly what I was going to respond with. So
Okay, thank you both. We have just a couple more. We do have some that may be a little bit more out of scope, so we might not be able to get to all the questions. But one is it assumed that the TDM switches cannot be touched to include software modifications? And that one might not be an easy one to answer either. I don't know if Phil or Jim or...
This is actually, yeah, this is Phil. I can answer that one. So and it depends on kind of what level of software modification we're talking about. If you're talking about capabilities that are within the software of the current switch generic, it could involve something like that. However, if we're looking at actual new development efforts where we're getting into manipulation of the code, the majority of, I think, if not all of those TDM switch is manufacturer discontinued. So that would be something that we would steer away from at a minimum, and because there's several comments that have been made in the past about visiting graveyards in order to find someone that could do that work. So, which is thus the reason why we've got manufactured discontinued type switches out there. So,
one thing I just might add, Phil, is that I think there's to some extent kind of an intermediate with some of the soft switches that often have SIP signaling that touch on the SIP network, where some of those are more active. So it kind of depends on which vintage. Although I think even a lot of those are manufacturer discontinued. But
yeah.
Thank you, Phil and Jim. I'm trying to look through the questions here to see if there's others. One maybe final one, and then let me know if this one's not a good one. Can you discuss possible differences in implementations for local calling arrangements from one company to another and calls using inter-exchange carriers?
So I'll take a stab at that if we want. So
yes, please, Jim. Thank you.
Yeah. So I mean, the scenarios that we're mapping out in our landscape, our framework document, will include ones that include inter-exchange carriers that are, well, both ones that are TDM based as well as ones that are SIP based. So I think that the intent certainly is that that kind of scenario would be covered by what we're describing. And again, if people want to join the group and contribute, if there are specific scenarios we're missing, contributions are always welcome.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim. And I think we have one final question for the call right now. Do you plan to support more VoIP signaling protocols like H323 and MGCP? You can not keep picking on Phil and Jim, but I don't know if either one of you might want to.
I'm happy to take that. Again, none of the contributions, the proposals we have so far explicitly address those, but we're contribution driven. If people have proposals that they want to do and they're willing to do it, and I'll just step back. It's worth explaining that this task force is not one where you bring a question and the experts go away and come up with the answers. This is an opportunity for the experts of the industry to come together and to progress the topics that people are willing to contribute to. So if people think it's a problem or a relevant problem and want to provide text to progress it, what you'll get is an industry experts that will provide feedback and help shape it and make sure that it works and strengthen it. So contributions are welcome.
Thank you, Jim. I think that was actually a great way to round out the panelists. So thank you all. We have run out of the questions for now, but Tom, Phil, Jim, thank you again for your presentations and providing the backgrounds and details regarding the launch of the ATIS PTSD non-IP call authentication task force. I'd like to remind attendees that the slides from today's webinar will be distributed in the near future to all registered participants. And Anna, if you don't mind just going to the very last slide. So on behalf of ATIS, thank you again for attending today's webinar and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.